Okay, so far our model of the macroeconomy has focused on consumption and investment, right? And we've said how consumption can change either because income changes and so we consume more as income goes up based on the marginal propensity to consume. It can change based on whether or not households are more confident or less confident. And it can change if their target level of wealth falls, right? So, or I should say if their wealth falls below their target level. Investment, on the other hand, can change based on interest rates, profit rates, and future aggregate demand, or expected future aggregate demand. But one of the questions that we want to answer in this chapter is the role that government spending can play, right? And so remember that total aggregate demand is equal to C, consumption, plus I, investment, plus G, government spending, plus X minus M, or net exports, so exports minus imports. So what we're going to talk about here is the role that government and trade play in the multiplier and what the government can do in order to try to smooth out the business cycle. So the fiscal multiplier is how much GDP changes in total based on an initial change in government spending. And this is going to be important because if the fiscal multiplier is high, then the government could increase spending during a recession and help us recover. If the fiscal multiplier is low, then increasing total spending during a recession isn't going to have much effect. Now, part of that is going to depend on the marginal propensity to import, which we're going to call little m. And it's the fraction of each additional unit of household income that's spent on imports. And for a country like the United States, it's pretty low. Remember, imports are sort of 15 to 20% of GDP, whereas for a smaller country, say in Europe, like Belgium or even France, which is not necessarily a small economy, that number is going to be larger. And that's going to affect how successful a government can be in helping an economy get out of a recession. So let's think about the government's role here. Put myself up here. So we know household behavior may either smooth or disrupt the economy, right? And so we talked about the paradox of thrift before, which is when everybody starts to save, then we can actually end up with a worse recession than we would have otherwise because they're not spending enough and so firms are producing less. The government can choose either to implement what are called automatic stabilizers, and we're going to talk about what those are, things like unemployment benefits, things like progressive taxes, or provide a fiscal stimulus to try to keep the economy out of a deep recession. So what are we going to do? Well, here we have a more expansive model of aggregate demand, because now we've got C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And look at this equation down here. Let me just get my drawing tool out. Look at this equation down here. That is going to be a more full picture of what our aggregate demand looks like. So we still have consumption. That's C0, autonomous consumption. Now, marginal propensity to consume depends not on total income, Y, but on disposable income. So 1 minus T, 1 minus the taxes that you pay, times Y. And so if your disposable income doesn't change as much, then your consumer spending won't change as much. Investment depends now on the interest rate, R. Government spending we can still think of as autonomous, especially sort of in the United States federal government spending, because they're able to borrow quite a bit. Exports, which are actually, we're not going to have too much control over, right? That depends on what's going on in other economies. Minus M times Y, that's how much imports we spend on output. So we're going to think about this in a little more detail and sort of think about what goes on and especially the role that taxes and transfers play in stabilizing the economy. Oops, gotta clear that. All right, so let's think about the role that government plays in our aggregate demand. So here we've got aggregate demand. We've got some equilibrium point A where it crosses the 45-degree line. we've got our equation for aggregate demand there that we looked at just now. Now, if consumer spending falls, right, so maybe people get nervous and they're worried about a recession, and aggregate demand shifts lower, and we move from point A to point B. So now we're in a recession. Well, what could happen is, what should the government do? Well, consumer spending goes down, income goes down. If income goes down, taxes go down. And if governments are worried about their budget, then they might cut spending. Well, if they cut spending, then that's going to lead to even lower output, and we'll move from point B to point C. Right? This is what a lot of countries did in Europe in the Great Recession. They were in a particularly difficult situation since they don't have their own currency. They all use the euro. At least almost all countries in Europe use the euro. And so faced with this fall in tax revenue and faced with investors who were a little bit nervous about buying their bonds, they had to cut government spending in what was called government austerity, and they ended up in an even worse recession. So that was especially true of Greece and Spain, but it was true to a lesser extent of other countries, Ireland, Italy, Portugal. They all experienced recessions that ended up being significantly worse than what we experienced in the United States. So this is sort of how we can think about what's going on, right? Is we have private sector decisions that can either dampen recessions and expansions or magnify them, right? So consumption smoothing is something that tries to dampen those fluctuations. If your income goes down, you still want to consume higher. If your income goes up, maybe you don't consume quite as much. And so that tends to dampen or offset the shocks that the economy is experiencing. On the other hand, for households that face credit constraints, they can't borrow as much as they would like, or they face rising value or falling value of collateral, that can change their wealth target. It can change their wealth. It can either raise consumption or hurt consumption. And rising sort of capacity utilization, which means how much of our productive capacity are we using, can encourage investment, adding to a boom. And then when the recession comes, investment falls, adding to the recession. And the government can play a lot of roles here, right? So automatic stabilizers are things like unemployment benefits, progressive taxes. Those things happen automatically when we enter a recession. And so if someone gets unemployed but they get unemployment benefits, then they don't have to cut their consumption spending by as much. If someone's income falls and so the taxes that they owe fall, then they don't have to change their spending by as much. If the government can come in and spend more during a recession or spend less during an expansion, then that can dampen the shocks faced by the economy. On the other hand, if they face a budget that has to be balanced, or they make mistakes, if they don't run surpluses during booms and so can't run deficits during recessions, that can amplify recessions, as we saw in some European countries. So let's think about government debt. So government debt is how much the government owes to bondholders. I'll move this down a little bit. So a government bond is just a loan to the government, right? And so in the United States, we have treasury bills, we have treasury bonds. That just depends. A treasury bill means that it matures in a year or less. A treasury bond means that it matures in more than a year. And so they're just loans that people have made to the government, individuals, banks, other central banks, and the government pays them interest. And it's not exactly like a household debt, because it's, if we think of it as, a whole, as the economy, it's just debt that we owe to ourselves. Some people want to borrow, some people want to save. Eventually we pay those bonds back, but we can borrow other bonds. Or we can sell other bonds and borrow other money. That said, it can't get too high, because eventually the interest gets too high. But if we think about the total debt, it's just the sum of all bonds sold minus the bonds that have matured, right? The primary budget deficit, right, which remember, deficit is a flow variable, whereas debt is a stock variable. The deficit is just revenue minus expenditures, right? It includes transfers, it includes interest payments, and as the deficits, if a government keeps having deficits, then its debt gets bigger. And usually what we care about is the debt to GDP ratio. And so if the debt is growing faster than GDP, then the debt to GDP ratio is getting bigger and bigger, and that can cause a problem, at least in the long run, because the interest that the government has to pay on debt gets too big, right? And so we say the budget deficit includes interest payments. The primary budget deficit does not include interest payments, and so it's something we often look at to see, all right, well, is this sustainable minus the interest that the government has to pay on its debt? So we can look at the UK as an example, and we can see that the UK has had debt that has been even above 250% of GDP. And if we look at Japan right now, their debt is above 200% of GDP. For the United States, it's just around 100%, but that's a lot higher than it had been over the last sort of 40 years, at least since World War II. There's no real level of debt that is a bad thing, right? It really depends on interest rates and interest payments and whether or not people will keep buying your debt, right? For the UK, they had a huge buildup of debt during the Napoleonic Wars, and then that fell off as they paid it back and as the economy grew. And then huge increase in World War I, World War II, and then that fell off until the Great Recession, and then it increased back up towards 100%, but it's still a lot lower than it has been historically. Now, trade is going to matter, right? So if other countries are experiencing booms and buying a lot of your products, then your exports are going to go up. On the other hand, if you import a lot of goods and services, then a lot of the increase in household spending or decrease in household spending will go towards imports. And so the fact is that both taxes and imports dampen the effect of the fiscal multiplier. So if imports are high, if taxes are high, fiscal stimulus is not going to have as large an effect as it would otherwise. And that's an important thing to remember.